So without any further ado, we are happy to call upon the member of opposition here.
3, 2, 1. Let's be clear about what the comparative is in this debate. In a world where mindfulness is not commercialized, it remains very small, it remains very out there, it remains a very small, devout group of followers that is not organized into something coherent as a whole. In a world where we have commercialization, we have businesses taking mindfulness on a large scale, reaching a wide variety of people, but also the accountability mechanisms associated with that. So what are we going to prove to you at closing opposition? 2 extensions. Firstly, why the commercialization of mindfulness increases the quantity of people who are going to access it. So if that's a standard that opening opposition has presented, we're going to win on that clash. But secondly, also, if mindfulness is all about the quality of delivery, why commercialization improves quantity. So if that's the metric that opening government presents, we also win on that clash. But before that, just a couple of bits of extraneous rebuttal, the rest is integrated. This first idea about people being misled into thinking like mindfulness is going to solve all of their problems, 3 quick responses. The first is that we're happy to regulate these sorts of claims. We already regulate false and misleading advertising. We think we can guard against that. Secondly, when people are in true need of mental health support, they're probably going to be seeing their doctors. Doctors can recommend whatever's most appropriate. Thirdly, if you're the type of person who looks for very quick, easy solutions to sorts of things, then you're probably not going to engage in anything else on the counterfactual. So that doesn't help you either. But okay, now let's have this look at this very radical point that closing government has brought to us about how mindfulness undermines social change. 3 responses to this. The first is that opening government has been quite consistent about mindfulness being good for you and society at large. So we're not sure if this is a knife or not. Secondly, we think they don't actually provide us the analysis as to why the commercialization of mindfulness is a tipping point to actually undermining social change. We asked them in a PI, they say it's a few people. We're not sure how that actually leads to large scale social change. Thirdly, when mindfulness is about accepting yourself and not judging yourself, I don't think that actually impacts your ability to be angry at injustices in wider society. They need to engage with that idea as well. Okay, first extension about the quantity of mindfulness being delivered and why that improves. 3 mechanisms here. The first, in terms of profit, increasing the supply of mindfulness, right? Because one of the barriers that we have under the status quo is that there's a limited availability of mindfulness training or ability for people to learn how to mediate and those sorts of things. They're probably important because that's how you actually get into the subject. You can get important information that way. Why does that exist? Because there's few people in the field. They can't be dedicated because there's no money in it. You can't just be a mindfulness trainer for a job when it's not commercialized and you're earning money from it, right? There's only so much free time that individuals have. So what changes when we introduce commercialization and profit? So we get money, right? That happens on 2 levels. Firstly, on an individual level, people are able now to become more professional. They're able to do mindfulness as their job, or at least something that brings them income so they can afford to spend more time on it. But secondly, on a wider societal level, we get more businesses or people wanting to be involved in this, right? That also increases the quantity of mindfulness that's being delivered. Second mechanism for increasing quantity, why we get advertising and marketing and why that's effective. So recognize that under the status quo, we have barriers such as information or knowledge or just a general lack of awareness of mindfulness, right? It's seen as something obscure. So why do we change that when we get advertising? 5 mechanisms for this. Firstly, we overcome the barriers that people have when they just don't know about this or haven't heard about it, they hear about it. Secondly, marketing is something that's been quite well studied over the years. So generally speaking, marketing is effective, especially if you're hiring people to do marketing, which is presumably what happens in the commercialized world. Thirdly, you can make quite compelling claims, right? Because if we accept that mindfulness is useful, you can make claims about that. Fourthly, even if not, if advertising weren't effective, then businesses wouldn't be doing it. That's just how economics works, right? But finally, also, when we get all of these extra people involved in mindfulness, when we get all of these people becoming more aware of this is a virtuous cycle, because it means that people are hearing about mindfulness from their friends as well. They see the benefits of that, that's closer to them, that gets more engagement. But finally, why this actually increases accessibility to everyone, not just rich people? 3 reasons. Firstly, because we fix the undersupply, we've talked about that already. Secondly, when we get more commercialization of firms in the industry, you're likely to post resources online in order to attract people, or have a free consultation session, or those sorts of things. We think everyone can benefit from that. Those things are free. And thirdly, in terms of economies of scale, right, in many cases, these are scalable things. You can distribute information over the internet. That benefits everyone as well. Okay, moving on to the second extension about how we also improve quantity, if that's the metric by which this debate is supposed to be judged. 3 mechanisms again for this. Firstly, just competition within the market, right? So Opening opposition talks about competition with one instructor. You can recommend this. We're going to take this way further. When you get large-scale commercialization, what that means is that there's like much more people being actually interested in getting mindfulness. We get that like increased quantity of engagement. So all of that's contingent on the previous analysis that we've given you. It also means that like there's more demand for mindfulness as a result, right? So businesses are more able to make profit. That means more firms get into the market. There's substantial increase in firms. That means there's significantly more options for people. Now, why are people likely to like take the best options and like the market therefore self-regulate or like self-compete into having good results, right? We think firstly, people can judge the results for themselves. When they go into mindfulness, they probably expect some sort of results. So if it's not very helpful, if it's not very effective, they're likely to switch to something else, given that we proved to you why we have so many other alternatives. So like you can compare them, you can talk to a friend, you can read reviews online, you can see like the qualifications of the people involved, if they have like psychology degrees and those sorts of things. Like naturally, we get that competition increasing quality. But secondly, we are probably going to likely to see some level of professionalism and standards within industry, right? Firstly, because there's like market incentives to say that you have professionals, that makes you look more legitimate, you get more money. But like secondly, if you have more people engaged, you'll be like more practiced and actually teaching people mindfulness. You're probably going to learn from that practice in yourself. Standards are probably going to be there as well to make the industry look professional and legitimate. Thirdly, in terms of research, right? Three reasons why we increase research. So firstly is that like we get a greater quantity of data. If we get more people involved in mindfulness, then we have a greater quantity of data. We have a greater segment of the population that we can look at. Secondly, we get like a greater variety of practices, right? When there's more people practicing this, there's probably more slight variations. We can see which one of those is most effective. And thirdly, there's probably more greater funding and interest within mindfulness, right? We get more interest in studying mindfulness from society and researchers. We get more funding from the parts of businesses who want to like stay one step ahead of the market by improving their practices through research and development. So what we tell you here is that like if the quality of the mindfulness that we're delivering is what matters in this debate, then we get that through the competition in market. And moreover, we also get better quality in the future because we provide the mechanisms by which people actually gain the knowledge about exactly what's going on here. This is important because most teams have recognized that like this is not a fully developed field. It requires a lot of research there, right? So in conclusion, like most of the teams in this debate, except for closing government, like already agree that mindfulness is good for most people. So like if we want to increase the quantity of mindfulness, we win. If we want to increase the quality of that being delivered, we also win. Vote closing opposition.
We thank the member of opposition for their speech. Before calling upon the government, we would like to remind, especially to the people watching at home, that speakers and teams were assigned a position in this competition, and the positions that they express are not necessarily their own, but rather the ones assigned to them. And with that, we are happy to call upon the government whip. Hear, hear.
Can you hear me? Yes? I'm going to start in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. Panel, we agree that mindfulness can sometimes be good. It can even help the mental health of some certain people. But the claim you're making is that the point at which mindfulness becomes toxic is when there are incentives on companies to market mindfulness in a way that exaggerates, first of all, what it is capable of accomplishing, and second of all, exaggerates the situations in which it is appropriate. To be clear, panel, then, the reason why we are beating teams that talk about quantity is because quantity is bad if the message is bad. So that deals with the quantity stuff. The other thing I just want to note is, sure, the other teams might agree about the situations when it is good. The fact that they haven't engaged with us is their failure rather than ours, and you should punish them for that. Okay, so let's talk about what Francesca gives you. Francesca tells you that there is incentive to market it in several ways. And she characterizes what that marketing looks like. But I just want to focus on a few things. The first thing I want to focus is that you market it as a lifestyle choice. You market it as the solution to every single of the problems. And the extra analytical reason why this is true is because if people were to accept it as a lifestyle choice or an integral part of their identity and something they use in every situation, that's the point at which people are far more likely to propagate their message through word of mouth, which is the main way in which this message propagates. And obviously, there are obviously other incentives to market it, because obviously when people see how good it is, they're more likely to buy into it, obviously. Okay. The other thing I want to note here is that there is no tension with our opening, because opening says rational, intelligent people are now less likely to buy into it. That's fine. But our claim is that there are some people who are quite gullible. Even if you are liberal, white, rich, you might still buy into this kind of thing. And that's bad because they're misled by these messages. So I think that's a very different group. We're consistent with our opening on that point. What do we get from closing opposition in challenge to this? Closing opposition says, marketing is not a problem because you can just regulate the advertisements. Several responses here. First response, it's very hard to regulate things like word of mouth, right? When the trainer that you go to teaches you that this is the solution to everything, and then you spread it to your friends and tell them, this is the solution to everything, you should go out and do it. That's hard to regulate. But second of all, even if this is about public advertisements, people get around this in a number of ways. First, they put the stuff that's good in like big font in the TV ad, and at the bottom, they put the small print putting the disclaimer. That's something that does happen in real life. Second of all, instead of focusing on like studies about whether this is academically good, you focus on individual case studies. You say, look at Mary. Mary did this thing. Mary changed her life completely. So yeah, you should follow Mary. So you get around this regulation. Third of all, you cherry pick academic studies to pick the academic studies which most favor to your side, right? So obviously, that's how this bad advertisement occurs. Lastly, I just want to note on this. This is a regrets motion, which is to say that we have to debate the motion as it actually happened. As it actually happened, this is the way advertisements played out. There were no regulations on their side. So probably this regulation point is out. Now, the next thing I'm going to do, so our case is standing. I'll talk about how this interacts with the debate in a bit. But the next thing I want to do is to yeet the closing opposition team out of this debate. So there are two arguments, right? The first argument is about increasing quantity. We've explained why if the message is bad, which I'll show in a bit, that doesn't matter. The next thing they talk about is that competition and funding increases quality. I have, broadly speaking, 5 responses to this. The first response is that there is a limit to how much quality you can improve. I would suspect that the message being sent is fairly simple. I don't know what kind of quality they're talking about in that respect. Second of all, in terms of gaining profit, right? And there's a clash here. They say the profit incentive will lead to them increasing quality. Our claim is that it doesn't lead to them increasing quality. It leads to them just doing more bad marketing, right? And here's why. In terms of gaining profit, the perception of quality is more important than quality itself. It is often more efficient to increase the perception of quality than it is to increase quality. First of all, because there are very small gains to be held in quality, and the most of the gains to be held are in terms of the perception of quality. That's why you focus your efforts there, as I've said. But more importantly, courses are often one-off. You do a 10-week mindfulness course and you so-called learn the skill and you're done. Or your company has a mindfulness workshop that is 1 day long. After doing that, you're done. The problem with this is that people pay upfront for the 10-week course, so the quality is irrelevant because they've already paid. And regardless of the success of the course, there are no repeat consumers. So once again, quality is irrelevant because people don't repeat the course. The third thing I want to note here in terms of quality though, is that if I am a competing company, I have no incentive to attack the legitimacy of the other company. Because if I were to attack the legitimacy of other companies, the entire edifice on which this industry is built, the lie that mindfulness is a solution to your problems, collapses. That's why each company has a collective incentive to not attack the other in this way. Fourth, given that mindfulness is all in your head, it is very hard to evaluate the quality of the training that you got. So it's very hard to compare quality. Fifth, you are told that if you do fail, it is your fault because look at all the other successful people who have succeeded with this. So because of that, it's very hard to evaluate quality. I don't think they get quality on their side. So what do we have that interacts with the round? Firstly, I want to interact with opening opposition. Opening opposition says, mindfulness allows you to process the difficulties of modern life. No, it doesn't. Two things here. First, it breeds complacency about you and your situation, right? Because once again, as we said, it's marketed not as a tool in the toolbox, but as a complete whole package solution. On the comparative on our side, when you are able to use that anger and frustration at your situation, that's what is more likely to spur you on. Contrast this to the messages that they tell you on the marketing, that you should just always let go of your anger, that letting go of your anger is always the solution. You should never act on your anger. The problem with this is that on their side, people might manage their frustrations better, but on our side, we've removed the source of that frustration entirely because people are now urged to act. Second response, right? I would argue that it actually makes it harder to process your frustrations if you believe in mindfulness, because sometimes processing things requires you to have deep conversations with the people around you. These conversations are less possible on your side because people around you who subscribe to the cult of mindfulness will tell you that you should live in the moment or that you should learn to let your anger go. So you're never able to process your anger by having conversations with other people. Briefly, I'm out of time, sorry. So we're talking about situations like your boss constantly like mistreating you. We're talking about things like microaggressions in the workplace that never get resolved because you're told to let it go rather than challenging the system. So that interacts with opening opposition. But we gave you two different impacts in this debate, right? Which are, first of all, people who have mental health problems who are not able to solve with mindfulness, but are told that they must be solved with mindfulness. And therefore, A, they never get the help they need because they don't go for things like proper therapy, that like CBT instead of mindfulness training. But B, when they do fail at mindfulness because the psychology in your brain, where like there are brain like neurons firing that make it impossible for mindfulness to work because it's a deep biological problem. These people feel like failures because they're unable to succeed at the thing that was supposed to solve their problem. And this increases the psychological burden of them. But the last thing Francesca told you was about social change. She told you that people are less likely to change. And because these are privileged individuals, they often have the capacity to change. We're talking about situations like people being willing to donate more, people being willing to, for example, change things in the workplace. But it also means that when minorities raise problems to privileged individuals, those privileged individuals are able to write off those problems as something that you should just be more mindful about rather than being angry about. You delegitimize the experiences of those people. And if you had listened to those experiences of those people, you might change the way you act. Look, panel, I think this is quite a marginal debate, but on the margins, we increase the amount of social good that people do to those around them. Pretty happy to propose.
We thank the government whip for their speech, and to conclude side opposition, indeed the entire debate as a whole, we're happy to call upon the opposition whip. Hear, hear. Ooh.
Okay, can everyone hear me? Great. Okay, I'm going to engage with each team on the metrics in which they claim this debate ought to be judged. I'm going to explain why either we win on those metrics or these metrics really aren't the metrics in which the debate should be judged. Let's talk about opening government. Their metric, their main one, is like quality. They say, look, bad intentioned actors will produce like really shit products. They're going to be like just generally low quality because of this like profit incentive to appeal to the lowest common denominator, which we think then kind of gets repeated in closing government. Okay, how do we respond to this? We say like, look, the market weeds them out. We say that industries, professionals have an incentive to kind of create a standard that says like, this is what counts as like a quality thing. We are certified. We have like source. We're informed by proper information. We have people who have like psychological training on this thing. We think they have an incentive to do this because like they want to be perceived as legitimate. We think a huge barrier for mindfulness is not being perceived as legitimate. Once you have this standard, we think you are much more likely to actually participate, to actually get customers because you are seen as legitimate. Secondly, we tell you that like, look, competition, word of mouth kind of stuff, right? Government whip kind of tells you that like word of mouth doesn't actually work as a method of like competition and improving standards because like apparently like you can't evaluate your own experiences. I think look, if you're promised that you are going to be like way happier in 10 days time and you look at yourself and you're like, I'm not, you can kind of say like this was bullshit. So I think there's going to be like competition in those two ways that actually going to drive up standards and commercialization because it creates this competition because you have more firms into the market. That means for reasons Andrew explains that I'll go on to, that means why you actually get better quality under our side of the house. Also note this isn't really that like comparative, like there's not necessarily a huge amount of regulation at the moment. We think even if actors are well intentioned, they're not necessarily that qualified. There's not this kind of big amount of resources to kind of invest in qualifications. The second metric about quantity, they say like people won't see it as legitimate because it's going to be like, because it's marketed, now we're going to somehow think it's like crystals, whatever other like BS things. Okay, note Andrew's analysis about the industry standards and like consumer feedback that I've just told you about means that like probably this is meaningfully different. You can say, look at these standards and look at the positive results you have from word of mouth that you don't get from these BS things like crystals that don't have any sort of scientific support. And additionally, like, even if it is the case that people kind of think it's like crystals and shit, well, a lot of people fucking buy into like crystals and all this like crap stuff. Like we think the quantity still probably increases even in the world in which they do think it's shit. So we think like, doesn't mean it is shit. Like if people perceive it to be shit, then who cares? There's not necessarily a huge barrier, and the popularity of a lot of like BS things kind of shows that, but we don't really think that's the case. Okay, opening opposition. What is their biggest metric? They talk about quantity. They say that like, look, commercialization will bring it to more people. Now this is what we say, but we actually explain this, right? We explain to you how, firstly by expanding, because commercialization essentially involves making money off these, it means profiting of these things. What do you do with this money? You reinvest it, you increase production. Additionally, you like have access to marketing now because you can invest this money. So we actually explain the mechanisms by which this becomes more popular. Firstly, because production is directly increased. Secondly, advertising makes it more popular. Additionally, like they kind of tell you that like, look, it needs to appeal within like a Western framework to these people, which requires like commercialization or something, whatever. Okay, we explain first of all why this like big effort to appeal to people is going to happen, which is what I just told you, that they're going to have much more money, which they can then reinvest into marketing. And additionally, like why is this actually going to be successful just because you try and market it? Andrew tells you that marketing people are professionals, you have money to employ professionals, and that is actually likely to be very convincing. So we think we beat OO because we actually explain why you get quantity. We also beat OO because we have this whole point about quality relating to like competition, holding people to account, standards, industry standards, all this stuff about quality, which is actually like hugely important. Additionally, it's more responsive to OG. We actually respond to OG's point of quality in a way that opening opposition don't. Okay, let's talk about closing government. Let's start with the government whip's attack on our case. They say, like, look, for somehow like, they don't even like understand what increased in quality look like. We say this has more accurate information. This seems like more research informing this thing. So we say people who are kind of like trained to be able to produce this sort of stuff. Like, yeah, we think there's clearly a way this can happen. The idea about like perception of quality matters more than quality itself. Okay, first of all, what I've just told you about like consumer feedback kind of suggests that like quality does actually lead to a perception of quality because you have a good experience. You say, look, I improved, or at least you say like these BS lies they told me were lies, and then we think it gets worse. Additionally, we say like this stuff about industry standards also responds to that, and they don't really engage with that, right? We say like, when you have this industry standard, which you're not going to give to this firm who's like come in and is marketing all these lies, we don't think they are going to actually be perceived as quality because they don't have access to this standard, right? Why is the industry going to care about standards? Well, like I say, the main obstacle is like a lack of legitimacy, right? A lack of seeing this as kind of a professional thing. It's not just like weird sort of thing that is not really backed by science, right? If you actually invest in training and resources and want to be perceived as legitimate, which is the main barrier to getting more consumers, you think you are going to do this. So the industry is going to care about this stuff. There is going to be a kind of standard that they're not going to give to these few firms that are marketing these things. Additionally, right, you can't become a successful firm by marketing lies. Why is this the case? Okay, because like you're never going to get like the positive feedback that leads to growing a business. You can only be at a very small level of business if you're selling all these lies, because people are eventually going to experience your products and never going to want to like recommend you or anything again, right? And we say like, look, their mechanism as to why these firms actually have kind of a thing is like they do loads of marketing and they sell these ideas, but they don't have the resources to do this in the first place if they don't get big, and they can't get big because like people don't like the product, it's a lie. Responding to their extension. Okay, they said their metric is social change, and like loads of responses to this, right? Okay, like the note their impacts are kind of all or nothing. You need to get like a load of people changing their minds in order to actually have this change from happening. We just need to prove that like more people will take up mindfulness. They need to prove that this is like a tipping point. They would have gone out to protest. They said that like rich people are probably fine with the status quo and probably aren't going to protest it, right? So we don't think these are the people that are really driving social change, right? We say how rich people can help is by recognizing the privilege they own have, indeed looking at their own experiences and how they look at the world and not judging themselves, you know, mindfulness. We think that's how you recognize your privilege, and that's how you actually effectively allow minority groups to protest. The whip kind of like tries to insert that it's going to be minority groups. We don't think that's going to be the case. Sure, cool, okay. Before I go into this last bit about mental health, I will take a POI from opening if they have one.
When perceiving mindfulness as a BS, which fails, then it is perceived as a hoax then no one will put any money in research or training in it.
Yeah, okay, but we give you loads of reasons why they're not going to perceive it as BS. Explicitly, when it becomes commercialized and you have money to an incentive to invest in these kind of standards, that doesn't respond to like anything you've just heard for the last like 21 minutes. Okay, right. So then this point about their extension about like mental health and going to therapy. First of all, we say it's not mutually exclusive. We say like, because of the reasons Andrew says, like mindfulness is probably, this response is like, look, if you're, yeah, we feel like, look, a big barrier to going to therapy is kind of realizing that you have your problems, whereas under the status quo, if you're not a very mindful person, we think often you realize your problems and you don't actually want to deal with them because they're like, it's like a very horrible thing that you'd rather hide from. If you accept those without judgment, you're much more likely to go to therapy. We also say that like, there's no actual like delta, sorry for using that word. Like if you only want to fix kind of like short-term problems and you don't actually want to engage with therapy and really address your problems, you're the kind of person who's going to be convinced by these short-term sales pitches, right? We think you're probably not the sort of person who is going to go to therapy anyway. So we don't think they explained why that was really a comparative. So because unlike our opening opposition, we actually explained why you get quantity, because we added quality, and because that responded to opening government and closing government, because we've dealt with their extension and dealt with their attacks on ours. We're pretty sure we've won this debate. Thanks.
We thank the opposition whip and all of the speakers in this debate. Please leave the room on all of your devices. Panel, please take a minute or two to review your notes and gather initial rankings.
Guys, you should be here. I will just make a breakout room.
Sorry. Okay, then we should get the people back
How-
on
Guys,
Discord.
you can be here. I will just do a breakout room in a minute.
Okay, no problems. So everybody gather your notes and yeah.
Sorry, I didn't quite catch that. Are we supposed to go somewhere or stay here?
You can stay here. I will allocate judges to the breakout room, so they will decide there, and we'll come back.
Great, thanks.
Astana, Байконур, Уральский, Каспий. Да. Noam, can you please join breakout room? I will ask from Noam if he is okay with still breaking the feedback. And if he says yes, yes, it will be streamed also. You're welcome.